Heard an amazing story a couple weeks ago. Stephanie Case is a Canadian ultramarathon runner. She's also a new mom. After several miscarriages, which can be absolutely brutal, she finally gave birth to a healthy little girl. And then she immediately went back to running after having the baby. In fact, 6 months later, she entered a 62-mile ultramarathon in Wales. The race just happened a few weeks ago, but she would stop throughout the 62-mile race to breastfeed her baby. So that would be tough, right? But guess what? Stephanie Case won the race anyway. And to think that I get winded running up and down the stairs. Amazing, right? Amazing. But her story reminds me of another ultramarathon runner named Cliff Young, who performed a feat way back in 1983 that's just as improbable. And I'm sure you know the fable of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. Well, get ready for the modern retelling because Cliff Young's remarkable story sets up today's message quite nicely. In 1983, the Westfield Group of shopping malls in Sydney, Australia, sponsored a unique ultramarathon. The foot race would cover the 500 miles between Sydney and Melbourne in one of the most inhospitable climates in the world. Organizers estimated that if the competitors ran 18 hours per day and slept 6 hours, they'd finish the race in about 6 days. And that's if they could finish it all, because this race was insane. So the most elite runners in the world descended upon Sydney with dreams of winning the $10,000 cash prize. And $10,000 went a lot further in 83 than it does today. Oh, and also, a 61-year-old potato farmer named Cliff Young also showed up. Everyone thought that it was a joke when he walked to the starting line wearing overalls and work boots. He must have looked absolutely ridiculous taking his place among the younger and fit athletes. Cliff didn't even have teeth. He took out his dentures so they wouldn't rattle in his head when he ran. And after the race started, he looked ridiculous. The other runners, fueled by adrenaline, pushed off with their long, elegant strides, but Cliff's running style was exactly what you'd expect from a 61-year-old man. His short strides were described as more of a shuffle than a run. And of course, the old man immediately fell behind. But he kept plugging along at a slow, consistent pace. Now, Cliff Young was no slouch. He grew up running all the time. He used to jog for hours, rounding up sheep on his parents' farm, as the family was too poor during the Great Depression to own horses. And he had previously run shorter distance races, but this ultramarathon was altogether different. It took a heavy toll on even much younger men, but Cliff kept going, and during the race, he imagined himself chasing sheep, like in the old days. At other times, he envisioned himself outrunning a storm on the prairie. But after that first day, he was far behind the pace. And when darkness set in, he didn't see the other runners stop to sleep. So he kept going, and he passed them. Eventually, though, his lead would evaporate as the faster runners caught up and passed him during the next day. So Cliff decided to forego sleep the second night, too. And he stretched out his lead further and further overnight until eventually the faster runners couldn't make up the difference. Cliff Young crossed the finish line with a time of 5 days, 15 hours, and 4 minutes, a full 10 hours faster than the second place competitor. He averaged just 4 miles per hour, which is barely faster than normal walking, but it was fast enough. And Cliff was shocked when the race organizers offered him the prize money. He didn't even know there was a cash prize. He was doing it for fun. And he felt bad about accepting the prize when the other 5 runners who actually managed to finish the race had worked just as hard as him to cover the 500 miles. So he split the prize money with the rest of them. What a guy, right? The media picked up on the story, making Cliff Young a national hero in Australia. And he caught the attention of the ladies, too. After his victory, the sexagenarian married a 23-year-old woman named Mary Howe. So there's that. Eat your heart out, Bill Belichick. But Cliff Young died at the age of 81, but he never stopped competing in marathons. And he never won again, by the way. He was a victim of his own success. Now everyone knew that the conventional wisdom about sleeping during ultramarathons was wrong, and so Cliff Young lost his competitive advantage. But no one can ever take away his 1983 victory. So what do we make of this? Well, I'm impressed by Cliff Young in a few ways. This guy was a stud. Not only could he run 500 miles almost nonstop, but he married a 23-year-old wife? That's crazy. But more seriously, I'm impressed with his demeanor. Cliff Young didn't panic. He didn't get rattled when the other racers caught up to him during the day and overtook him, because it would have been so tempting to push himself beyond his ability in an attempt to stay ahead of them. It would have been so tempting to try to run ahead. But he patiently stuck with the plan. He kept going at his own pace, and he persevered. It reminds me of what the author of Hebrews wrote in the New Testament. Hebrews 12:1, he wrote, "Let us run with patience the race that is set before us." Patience is such a virtue. Patience is the opposite of panic. When situations in life start to deteriorate and times get desperate, it's so easy to overreach with desperate measures that we sometimes take. It's so easy to overreact. It's so easy to try to do more than we should. Maybe we do something out of character or try to justify doing wrong, and then we get burned. Times of desperation make us vulnerable to really messing up our lives. But times of desperation are also an opportunity to solidify our reputations, character, and leadership. Because you need not be a victim of your circumstances. And so we're going to visit King Saul today in his time of dire need. In today's passage, we're going to watch him struggle to hold the pace as his competitors are closing in. And as it turns out, he could have learned a thing or two from the perseverance and patience of one Cliff Young. So I want to encourage you to turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 13. 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 through 14, we're going to look at today. And if you didn't bring a Bible, that's okay. Just take out one of ours from the shelf underneath the pew in front of you, and you turn that Bible to page 234. 234, you'll find 1 Samuel 13, or there's a QR code on the worksheet in the bulletin. Scan that with your smartphone, and it will take you straight to 1 Samuel 13. The story of King Saul in the Old Testament reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. Saul enjoyed noble status, made quite the impression with people, but he also managed to experience a tremendous reversal of fortune because of his tragic flaws, and he suffered a dramatic downfall. And so in these ways, he's very much in the same league with the fictional characters of Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear. And so for our next series of messages, we're going to learn from the example of King Saul, mostly from the negative example. He's the Bible's most prominent tragic hero. And so this is the Shakespearean tragedy of King Saul. But King Saul didn't fall in a day. There were many steps that led to his tragic end. And we find the first and perhaps biggest step in today's passage. Saul was in a huge jam. He was facing desperate times. He was scared, and his life and his calling seemed to be hanging in the balance. So he resorted to desperate measures in these desperate times. But as we're about to see, good choices are rarely made in the midst of desperation. And Saul ended up getting burned. So let's look at 1 Samuel 13, starting in verse 1. It says this: Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 with Saul in Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it, said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were calling out to join Saul, were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash, to the east of Beth-aven. So if you remember, the Israelites specifically wanted a king to fight their battles for them. Look what it said back in 1 Samuel 8. They said, "There shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." So defeating nations like the depraved Philistines was the entire justification for Saul's position. If he failed here, then he was sunk. Well, as we just read, it wasn't long before he got his first major challenge from the Philistines. Saul and his son Jonathan had won a minor skirmish against the Philistines at Geba, and now Saul had the confidence to raise up a fighting force to finish off the Philistines for good. But in response, the Philistines raised up a massive army that dwarfed the Israelites' forces, and Saul knew that he was in trouble. Let's pick up the story in verse 6. 1 Samuel 13, it says, "When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. And Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him." So Samuel had given Saul clear instructions. Remember from our previous messages that Samuel was a holy man of God who had earned the respect of the entire nation. And Samuel had told Saul that he would meet him in 7 days, whereby he would offer a burnt offering to the Lord on behalf of the Israelite army to seek God's favor. Now, that sacrifice would have really instilled confidence in the fledgling Israelite army because they trusted Samuel. But right now they were horrified of the tens of thousands of heavily armed enemy soldiers who were closing in. And folks, make no mistake, ancient warfare was terrifying. It's almost beyond description. Until relatively recent technological developments, warfare really hadn't changed much throughout history. Men fought on horseback. They used bow and arrows. They stabbed each other with swords. They beat each other with clubs. And in some cases, they strangled each other with their bare hands. To give you a sense of how terrifying it was, I want to read to you an excerpt from the work of Jean Froissart, who was an eyewitness of the 100 Years' War between England and France. It was one of the most brutal wars in history. And here is his description of the Battle of Pontier, which occurred on September 19th, 1356, outside of Pontier, France. He wrote this: "The battle raged fiercely from morning until late afternoon, with neither side willing to yield. The English archers, positioned with great skill, let fly their arrows so rapidly and in such numbers that the sky seemed darkened, and the arrows fell like a deadly hailstorm upon the French ranks. Many knights and men-at-arms fell, pierced through their visors, faces, and bodies, their cries of pain mingling with the clashing of swords and the neighing of wounded horses. The French cavalry, weighed down by heavy armor, struggled to advance through the chaos and the thick litter of fallen men and horses. Amidst the carnage, horses foamed at the mouth from exhaustion and wounds, some wildly trampling their riders, or others caught beneath their hooves. The ground was slippery with blood and strewn with broken weapons and shattered shields. The combatants, torn and weary, grappled desperately, some calling for ransom to save their lives, others begging for death to end their suffering. The day was marked by great slaughter, and it seemed as though the earth itself was soaked with the blood of the fallen. Many noble knights and common soldiers alike were left broken and dying on the field, while the survivors looked on in horror and exhaustion, knowing the battle had changed the course of history." After experiencing battles like this, men were never the same. So it isn't any wonder why the Israelites were absolutely terrified. Even the most battle-hardened soldier trembled with fear at the thought of ancient warfare. But these Israelites, they were farmers and herders. So we can't begin to imagine how badly they needed Samuel to come and bless them. Even the most irreligious man would have welcomed God's blessing at a time like this. But the Israelites were losing their nerve. Samuel was indeed on the way. He had promised to be there. But the Israelites were abandoning Saul at an alarming pace. And his kingdom was slipping away before his very eyes. So Saul started to panic. Pick up the story in verse 9. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering to me and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "Well, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." So Saul, seeing his army scattered, took matters into his own hands. To keep them from running, he offered the sacrifice himself. And this was a blatant violation of God's laws. For whatever reason, God was explicit that no one other than those from the tribe of Levi, such as Samuel, should do the religious work in Israel. Way back in Numbers 18, the law was written, "And behold, I have taken your brothers, the Levites, from among the people of Israel. They are a gift to you given to the Lord to do the service of the tent of meeting, and you and your sons with you shall guard your priesthood for all that concerns the altar and that is within the veil, and you shall serve." And so Saul knew this. He knew he had no right to offer the sacrifice. He had been warned by Samuel not to do this. But Saul was desperate. He was scared. So like the other runners, they were catching up to him. Time was running out. But instead of patiently persevering until Samuel arrived, Saul took matters into his own hands. And as we're about to see, man, he got burned. Picking up in verse 13, it says, "And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Now, I don't think God was so concerned about Saul following all the rules. God just wanted Saul to trust him. God wanted him to be the kind of king who could calmly and decisively lead his people. But Saul folded under the pressure. And Samuel's reply to him seems harsh, right? At first glance, it seems like God completely rejected Saul because he made one little mistake. And that scares us, right? Because we're going to continue to make all kinds of mistakes in life, right? So who's to say that God won't be done with us after we sin? And this is kind of the way I used to think about it, reading passages like this. But we need to remember a few things. First of all, Jesus is the perfect representation of God's nature. So whenever we see God do something in the Old Testament that kind of surprises us, then we need to interpret it through the lens of Jesus. And Jesus never rejected anyone for messing up. His disciples sinned over and over again. Yet Jesus was patient with them. But beyond that, Samuel is clear that God didn't reject Saul as a person for messing up. He didn't reject the person. God just rejected his kingship, right? But guess what? None of us have a kingship. So we don't need to worry about that. And finally, I don't think God rejected Saul as king for making this one mistake. This situation was simply a microcosm of Saul's entire career, as we're going to look at it in this series. This is the kind of thing that Saul always did. Impulsivity was his fatal flaw. Saul was impatient, and he struggled to trust God. So it wasn't Saul's mistake that caused God to reject his kingship. It was really his character. This was just who he was, and he wouldn't change. You see, flaws don't become fatal until we refuse to deal with them. And Saul refused to come to terms with his own weaknesses. So the lesson here isn't, well, one strike and you're out. That's not the Jesus way. That's not the nature of God as demonstrated by Jesus. God simply allowed the natural consequences of Saul's sin to play out. And it cost him his kingdom. But God still loved Saul. And so did Samuel. And so let's kind of move beyond this as we look at this passage. We don't have a tit-for-tat relationship with God. We don't have kind of a crime and punishment relationship with him anymore, because Jesus has taken all the punishment for our crimes through his death on the cross. He was resurrected in victory, and we simply receive his salvation by faith and not by works. Jesus said, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." And so, believer, you are saved. Jesus took the punishment for your crime. That's good news, right? So trust in him. Trust in him today. So now that we've put kind of all those fears to bed, let's allow this passage to really challenge us on maybe a deeper level. Because we all experience desperate times, as Saul did in this passage. Now, we may never face, hopefully, the desperation of war, especially ancient warfare, but we all face the quiet desperations of life. We all face internal crises. We sometimes feel our dreams slipping away, right? As Saul was hemorrhaging soldiers, sometimes we find ourselves hemorrhaging money, for instance, with one financial emergency after another. Or maybe you feel like you're hemorrhaging away your years. You feel the quiet desperation of getting older. Maybe your life hasn't exactly panned out as you'd hoped. Maybe your family's in crisis. Maybe you feel like one of your kids or your grandkids are slipping away from you. Maybe your marriage feels like it's in crisis, and that's tough. Maybe your career is slipping away from you. Or maybe you're involved in some bad activities, and like Saul was, and maybe you're way in over your head. Sin burns, doesn't it? And life is desperate sometimes, and so we need to learn how to make a good life in the midst of desperate circumstances. We've all heard the phrase, desperate times call for desperate measures. But you know what? That's not the Jesus philosophy. Instead, the Jesus philosophy is found in our main point from today's passage. It's in your bulletin if you'd like to write it down. The main point is desperate times call for measured minds. Desperate times do not call for desperate measures. Desperate times call for measured minds. I've already talked about the desperation of war, and the Great War brought a desperation to Western civilization unlike anything before it. And so when America joined the Allied powers in April of 1917, there was some level of panic in the country. People were scared of the enemy, and they were scared for the security of their country. Okay, and so because the message they were getting was like the war needs to be won at all costs. And the future of Western civilization depends on us. And anything that jeopardized the war effort needed to be stamped out. But some people in America weren't so keen on the war, World War I. They thought that America had no business inserting itself into Europe's pointless war where millions and millions had already died, basically for the imperialistic fancies of their emperors. And those people were probably right, but those voices weren't so popular back then. And they scared people. And so people were like, well, those voices need to be silenced. And that's where a magazine called The Masses came to the forefront during World War I in America. The Masses was basically, it was just a socialist rag that was highly critical of America's involvement in the war. And as a result, Thomas G. Patton, the postmaster of New York, refused to allow the magazine to be sent through the mail. Patton was of the opinion that the Masses violated the Espionage Act of 1917, which limited criticism of the war effort in times in the name of national security. The philosophy behind the Espionage Act was this: during desperate times of national emergency, free speech should be limited, despite what the Constitution says. Because desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So the two sides went to the United States District Court in the Southern District of New York, where Judge Learned Hand presided. And we can't imagine the pressure Judge Hand must have been under to do something about those dissenting voices. Somebody had to do something to stop them. But Judge Hand was not given to the philosophy of desperate times calling for desperate measures. He was under the impression that desperate times called for measured minds. He saw through all the emotion that was boiling over in the country at the time and came to the conclusion that the Constitution wasn't null and void just because there was a national emergency. So he chose to do exactly nothing to the Masses magazine. He would not impede the distribution of the magazine, even though he may have disagreed with it. And even though this decision would be overturned on appeal, Judge Hand's ruling set the precedent for future free speech cases that were tried before the Supreme Court. And so today, thanks in part to Judge Learned Hand, we have the freedom to express unpopular opinions in good times and in bad times. He understood that desperate times call for measured minds. We cannot allow ourselves to be coerced into doing something out of desperation, fear, or public pressure. Look at what Saul told Samuel in verse 12, because it's very telling. Saul said that he felt forced to offer the sacrifice. He forced himself to do it, or he felt compelled to do it, as some translators put it. And when we get desperate, we start to force things, don't we? But look at what the Apostle Peter wrote, 1 Peter chapter 5. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. And so anxiety and desperation, according to Peter, calls for what? Desperate measures? No. Calls for sober-mindedness, not rash and reckless behavior. Basically, we're the same people in a desperate time than we are in a regular time. And it certainly doesn't call for us to sin, as was the case with Saul. So, what should you do the next time you face a crisis? Or maybe you're in a crisis right now. Should you panic? Should you force it, as Saul did? Should you try to shut up other people? I don't want to hear it. Should you rush ahead? Should you resort to desperate measures? Well, someone needs to do something. Or should you do the exact opposite of that? Should you approach the heated situation with cool indifference, as did Judge Learned Hand? Should you exercise the patience of a Cliff Young while the other people are catching up with you and closing in on you? And so the latter, rather than the former, is our application from today's passage. In your bulletin, if you'd like to write it down. The application is, in desperate times, make reflection your first reaction. Make reflection your first reaction. See, desperate times, what do? Our first reaction is just reaction, right? It's just reaction. Do something to fix this. But what if in a desperate time we made reflection our first reaction? Let me talk about that a little bit. Who are the true leaders among us? Maybe you lead a team at work. Maybe you lead your family. Maybe you lead a ministry. Maybe you just lead yourself. And some leaders, when crises come, just react, right? I'm sure you've seen that. That's what Saul did. The crisis comes, reaction. Next crisis, reaction. And sometimes raw reaction is called for. If a bull is charging, react, right? Get out of the way. But sometimes leaders panic and overcorrect when there's a problem. And I'm very guilty of this sometimes, okay? But the next time you are in a crisis, I want you to watch the people who are calm. Those are the people you need to follow. Those are the people you need to emulate. And you need to be that kind of leader. Proverbs 17:27, it says, whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. We need to strive to demonstrate this cool spirit that Solomon talked about. And so the next time you're desperate, the next time a crisis comes along, next time maybe you come under fire for something, job one is to check yourself, okay? Job one's not to fix the problem. Job one's not to shut up the critics. Job one's not to, just like react and do something. Job one, before anything else in a crisis, is to check yourself. Job one is to get your head and your heart right. Job one is to reflect on what's going on inside. Am I living the Jesus philosophy? Am I walking the Jesus way? Is my heart calm and right? Job one is to do nothing but to reflect and check yourself. Proverbs 16:32, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. All right? Better is the person who reflects than the one who just takes over a city. So rather than reacting, rather than panicking, rather than just doing something, anything to fix the problem, pause, take a breath, make sure you're in the right headspace to make a good decision. Remember the flight attendant speech, right? You fly, secure your own oxygen mask first, right? If there's an emergency and the masks start falling from the ceiling, put on yours first. So I say, well, that's selfish. What about the kid sitting next to me? Listen, if you pass out, you won't be good for anyone else. Matter of fact, you'll be a liability at that point. Likewise, what good is a firefighter who recklessly runs into a building that's burning without any kind of plan? If he becomes incapacitated, not only will he be useless to help other people, but precious time and resources will need to be diverted to save him too. Same is true for any difficult time in life. Listen, Saul was on the right track here. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He was running his race. He had lined up God's people against the enemy. And Samuel, he was almost there. He was on his way to bless them. God was on the verge of securing a great victory for Saul. But just when we're on the verge of something great, that's when the devil comes out. That's when people get scared. That's when people just start reacting. People, abandon their posts. And others, like Saul, well, they just overreact, right? They just overreact. They act rashly. They panic. They do whatever the prevailing emotions at the time demand from them. I'm sure there's people who was warning Saul, I don't know if you should do this. Shut up, okay? I'm going to do this. But not you. Not anymore. Next time you're overwhelmed, next time you're outnumbered, you're in trouble, the first thing you're going to do, job one, you're going to reflect. You're not going to react. You're going to reflect. You're going to make sure that you are operating from a Jesus perspective from the inside out. You're not going to just believe what your emotions and circumstances are telling you, what other people are telling you. Instead, you're going to look at the cold, hard reality from a sober mind, as Peter said, and a quiet spirit. You're not going to gripe and complain and wish for circumstances to be different. You're going to accept your fate as it is. You're not going to shuffle the responsibility to act onto someone else. You're going to make your own decision and take responsibility for it. You're not going to lose your perspective. You're going to practice simplicity and contentment and gratitude. You're going to make sure job one is to check yourself first. You're not going to drown in sorrow. You're going to approach the problem with a detached curiosity. You're not going to try to control anyone or manipulate them. You're going to fix yourself first. You're not going to catastrophize. You're going to know that everything's going to be okay ultimately. And you're going to take a moment or an hour or a night to get yourself right. lined up with the Jesus philosophy, knowing what you got to do. And then you're going to act. You're not just going to react. You're going to reflect. And then you're going to act. Or you won't act. But whatever you do, it won't be out of a sense of desperation. Here's what the Apostle James had to say about performing under pressure. He said, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger," okay? So you're going to be quick to reflect, not react. By the way, did you ever see Jesus panic? Did you ever see Jesus just snap at people? Did you ever see Jesus just go along with the emotions of the moment or the whims of the crowd? No, because Jesus' first reaction was always reflection. Look what he said in Luke 14, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost?" The worst decisions are made during times of desperation. But oftentimes, desperate times do not call for desperate measures. Desperate times call for measured minds. So the next time you're feeling like you're running out of time, the next time your patience is running out, the next time you're faced with desperation, don't just react, reflect, because that is the Jesus way. So God told Saul that at some point his leadership would end and he would be replaced. And everyone must have assumed that his son Jonathan would take his place. We got a little preview of Jonathan today. And so I'm going to encourage you to read 1 Samuel 14 this week. And you bring a friend next Sunday, and we're going to find out why Jonathan, in people's minds, was such a good fit for a king. One of my favorite characters in the Bible. We have precious little information about Jonathan, but we're going to get some of it next week. So please come. I think you'll enjoy it. Let's pray. Lord, what a good day this is. What a good morning. And God, these kind of messages are hard because it's easy to reflect when we're safe here in church, but when the crisis comes, it's so easy to just react and take desperate measures into our own hands and panic and not listen. And Lord, so I just pray for these folks right now. All of us are going to face crises in life. But I pray, Lord, that when the crisis comes, I pray that job one for them will be to check themselves, to stop, to pause, and reflect. And Lord, I pray that as we anticipate those crises coming right now in the good times, that we would practice this reflection, that we would make sure, job one, before we get anyone else's oxygen mask on, we are checking ourselves, making sure we are okay, so that when the hard time comes, we'll still be okay. Help us, Lord, to reflect on you and the Jesus life and live out that kind of life. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.